The sun slipped like honey across the plains, casting its golden sorrow over dry creeks, crooked rooftops, and thirsty land. Dust danced in tired swirls along the fence posts, and the wind hummed through the brittle grass like an old fiddle straining to remember a song. This was a place where folks didn't waste breath on dreams. You did your chores, kept your head low, and prayed for enough rain to keep the well wet. Clara Mayfield was 4, but already she knew silence better than laughter. She knew how to gather eggs without scaring the hens, how to stir the pot of cornmeal mush without burning the bottom, and how to keep her questions tucked behind her teeth. She'd learned it by watching her mother. Loretta Mayfield, thin as wire and twice as tense, moved like a woman always halfway through swallowing grief. She worked the land alone, ever since her husband was buried in the canyon mine 2 winters back. Folks said she'd taken up widowhood like armor, wearing her loneliness like a badge she wasn't ready to lay down. They lived on the edge of town, just where the scrubland turned wild and the trees began to whisper in a language older than fences. The cabin stood humble and sun-bitten, its porch sagging, its windows clean but tired. Clara didn't know it was a poor home. To her, the chipped teacup she used for soup was just the right size for a child's hands. But she did notice how other children never stayed long when they visited, how their mothers clutched them tighter when they walked back into town, whispering behind narrowed eyes. That morning had begun like most others. Loretta had gone down to check the hens while Clara sat on the porch, swinging her feet and watching the sky. She had a habit of talking to the wind when no one was listening. But that morning, the wind didn't talk back. It stilled, sharp and sudden, and that's when she saw him. A boy stood at the edge of their field, just beyond the last crooked post of the split-rail fence. He was small but older than Clara, maybe 6 or 7, though it was hard to say with his ribs showing and his limbs thin as willow reeds. His skin was the color of sun-warmed clay, his hair long and tangled like wind-blown brush. He wore no shoes, just a scrap of tunic and silence. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching the smoke curl from the cabin's chimney. His eyes were deep, not dark, but deep, like still water that had seen too many stones tossed in. Clara felt something settle heavy in her chest. She slipped off the porch, barefoot in the red dirt, and crept back inside. The stew pot was near empty. Still, she scraped what she could. Half a scoop of mush, 2 wilted beans, and tucked a cold biscuit beside it in a tin cup. Her fingers curled around the edge as she stepped outside again, heart knocking against her ribs like a caged bird. She didn't walk all the way to the fence, just close enough that he could see her. Then she set the cup down in the dust, backed away, and sat cross-legged in the grass. The boy stepped forward, careful, slow, like something half-wild. He picked up the cup and didn't say thank you, but Clara didn't need him to. He ate with quiet hunger, his face unreadable. When he finished, he set the tin down exactly where she'd left it. Then he turned and slipped back into the trees without a sound. Loretta never saw. Or if she did, she didn't let on. That night, as the shadows thickened and the fire sputtered low, Clara stared at the door long after her mother had gone to bed. She wasn't waiting for the boy to return. She just wanted to know if he'd made it somewhere warm. The next morning, town was murmuring like a stirred hornet's nest. Reverend Doyle stood outside the chapel, arms crossed tight over his belly, talking with Sheriff Boone. "Saw tracks just north of the creek," he said, voice sharp. "Don't need those kind sneakin' around. Next thing you know, someone's cow's gone or worse." Sheriff Boone didn't answer. He just shifted his weight and squinted toward the horizon. When Loretta approached, holding Clara's hand, Doyle's eyes narrowed. "You're on the edge of it, Miss Mayfield. Best keep that little girl close. You never know what sort of trouble strays bring." Loretta nodded, lips pressed thin. Her grip on Clara's hand tightened. Inside the general store, the whispers followed them like smoke. "Wild little savage. Came right up to the old fence, they say. And she's got a child." Clara didn't understand all the words, but she understood tone. The same way she understood the way Loretta's shoulders pulled tighter when they left town, and how her voice didn't rise again for the rest of the day. Later, at home, Loretta knelt to scrub Clara's apron and paused when she saw the faint bean stains. "Where'd you get this?" she asked, her voice low. Clara didn't lie. She didn't know how to. "He was hungry," she said. "He didn't ask. I just gave it." Loretta said nothing. Just sat back on her heels, water dripping from the cloth in her hand. For a long time, she stared out the window, eyes far away, like maybe she was remembering something she'd buried deep. Then she rose, wrung the cloth hard, and hung it on the line. That night, she locked the door. But Clara didn't sleep. She sat by the window, blanket around her shoulders, staring out into the dark, listening to the wind return with its ancient hum. And she wondered if he'd eaten again, if his feet hurt, if he had a mother somewhere who was worried, or if he was like her, trying to fill a space no one else could see. The boy didn't come back. Not that night, not the next, but something had shifted. Something in the air, in the trees, in the bones of the land. And in Clara. She stopped talking to the wind. She started listening instead. And she would never forget the way a single shared meal, cold, humble, and offered without words, could echo louder than any sermon. By the time morning came, the wind had changed. It no longer sang the high, lonely whistle of dry plains. It moved with purpose, low and steady like breath over embers. The air carried something unspoken, something old, as if the ground itself were holding its breath. Loretta felt it before she saw anything, standing at the stove, staring out the window over Clara's shoulder. The child was still in her nightdress, hair sleep-tangled, small hands wrapped around a cup of warmed milk. But her eyes were fixed on the horizon with a stillness Loretta had never seen in her daughter before. From the tree line beyond their field came figures, 5 of them, slow and deliberate, wrapped in earthen cloth and silence. They did not walk with urgency, yet each step carried the weight of generations. The boy was among them, walking at the center. Elon. His posture was no longer hollow. His eyes no longer lost. He walked like someone who belonged again. Loretta's pulse jumped. Her first instinct was to gather Clara, to bolt the door and stay behind it. Not out of hatred, but fear. Fear of what the town would say. Fear of being caught between 2 fires. The gossip of Dry Creek and the quiet certainty of these strangers crossing her land. But she didn't move. Clara stood, slowly, as if drawn by a thread of breath. She didn't wait for permission. She opened the door and stepped out into the gold-washed morning, bare feet against the dirt. Loretta followed, cautious, the screen creaking shut behind her. She watched the elders approach, watched the way the town began to take notice too, faces peeking from curtains, boots crunching across gravel as Reverend Doyle and Sheriff Boone came from the chapel hill, drawn like moths to a flicker. No one spoke. The silence was thick, dignified. Even the birds seemed to pause. The tallest elder, a woman with silver braids and a face lined like river stone, stepped forward. Nahi. She held a small bundle in her hands, wrapped in deerskin and tied with woven twine. She didn't raise her voice, didn't ask for anything. She knelt. In front of Clara. The girl blinked, unsure, glancing once at her mother. But Loretta didn't speak. She watched. And in watching, her breath caught in her throat. Nahi offered the bundle. "You saw him," she said in accented but steady English. "You saw the child, not the shadow." Her voice held no bitterness, no accusation. Only truth. "You gave with no ask. That is sacred." Clara reached out, hands trembling a little, and took the gift. She opened it slowly. Inside lay a doll, carved from juniper wood, its face simple but tender, wrapped in cloth dyed with earth tones. It smelled of cedar and sage and something faintly sweet. A mother's scent. Clara clutched it to her chest. From the edge of the gathering, a low voice spoke. "That your way of sayin' thanks?" It was Reverend Doyle, his arms crossed, eyes cold with suspicion. Nahi stood, turning to him. "That is our way of remembering." Doyle scoffed. I don't much like the idea of strangers coming to our doors. Sheriff Boone cleared his throat but didn't interrupt. He stood with his hands resting lightly on his belt, eyes flicking between the elders and the child, the preacher and the mother. He wasn't a man who liked to speak unless it mattered. Loretta stepped forward now, heart thudding so hard she thought it might split her ribs. They didn't come to take, she said, voice thin but firm. They came because my daughter did something kind. Something most adults forgot how to do. Doyle turned toward her, his mouth tightening. And what if they'd taken more than beans, Loretta? You trust that risk with your girl? Loretta didn't flinch. I trust that kindness matters more than fences. There was a stillness then. Not the kind born of peace, but of people unsure what to say when the script changes. When an old song is rewritten before their eyes. Elon stepped forward. He stopped in front of Clara and reached out a hand, not to take but to offer. He didn't speak. But he didn't need to. Clara placed her hand in his, and the two of them stood there like saplings side by side, new roots reaching in the same direction. Doyle muttered under his breath and turned away. The elders said nothing more. They nodded once, solemn, final, and turned back toward the trees. No one stopped them. No one dared. Boone gave them a long, unreadable look, then tipped his hat. Clara and Elon stood in silence, long after the others had faded into the woods. Loretta didn't call her inside. She only returned to the porch and sat, letting the coffee go cold in her cup. She watched them like she might watch the first shoots of spring after a bitter winter. Quiet, hopeful, unsure. That evening, the boy returned alone. Clara was already waiting on the porch. This time, she'd set out 2 cups, one for him, one for her. Loretta came to the door, holding a fresh plate. Beans and cornbread, nothing fancy, but warm. Without a word, she handed it to the boy and nodded once before returning inside. The wind whispered through the grass. Distant coyotes howled their evening songs. And for a long while, the only sound between them was the scrape of spoons and the shifting of boots against wood. When they finished, Clara leaned her head gently on Elon's shoulder. He didn't move away. He didn't speak. Neither did she. And somehow, the silence between them was the loudest thing of all. The stars came out slowly, one by one, as if shy at first. The moon rose fat and gold. And there, beneath the worn boards of a tired porch, a kind of peace settled. Not the sort shouted from pulpits or carved into law, but the sort born of small mercies, of quiet understanding, of wounds tended without asking. Sometimes it's not the fire that saves us. It's the hand that offers warmth before the cold gets in. And that night, Clara knew, some stories begin with loss but they are rewritten with grace. Word by silent word. Meal by humble meal. And sometimes the smallest kindness echoes louder than the loudest fear.